Hello and welcome to Penmanship, a podcast about Australian writing culture. I'm your host, Andrew McMillen, and my guest today in episode 37 is Richard Guilliatt. When it comes to the art of writing magazine feature stories, Richard is among Australia's masters of the form. He has been writing magazine-length articles for more than 2 decades and has won several Walkley Awards along the way. His subject matter and profiles are diverse, which he admits is part of the job description when writing for a general interest publication like the Weekend Australian magazine, where he has been a staff writer since 2006. He has also written 2 books about vastly different topics, which we explore in some detail in this episode. I have a close relationship with Richard. Soon after we met for the first time at an investigative journalism conference in 2011, I asked if he would be my mentor. During those 6 years, his advice has been enormously helpful, as I learned how to pitch, structure, and write magazine features under his guidance. For the first few years, I would send him drafts of my work before filing to my editors, and his feedback always improved my writing. Richard has been one of the most significant influences in my career as a freelance journalist, and I feel incredibly lucky to have had such a generous and wise ally in my corner. We don't discuss his mentorship during this episode, but I think it's important to note here at the beginning. In March, I visited Richard at his home in Sydney, and our conversation touches on how he comes up with ideas for magazine stories while juggling his own interests and his editor's suggestions. How an editor at The Age pushed Richard out of his comfort zone as a young journalist in order to improve his reporting and writing. How he worked as a freelance writer based in New York City for 7 years. How he co-wrote a book about a German warship whose mission was to create panic among the Australian public during World War I. And how he became interested in writing about controversial subjects such as repressed memory and, more recently, the deception of public figures such as cancer hoaxer Belle Gibson. A quick note about audio quality. There is a bit of table bumping in this episode, which is a fault of my microphone placement. Apologies for this. I hope it doesn't detract from the quality of the conversation. Introducing Richard Guilliatt, author and staff writer at the Weekend Australian magazine. Richard Guilliatt, thank you for joining me.
Pleasure.
It's Wednesday morning, or just gone midday Wednesday, and we're in your home. Where are you in the process of story creation or story searching or soul searching in your job as a staff writer for the Australian magazine?
Oh, let's not go to the soul searching. That's an ongoing process. I'm working at the Weekend Australian magazine, where I've been for the last 10 odd years, and I'm currently doing quite a complicated investigative piece about a criminal case, and hoping to finish that in the next couple of weeks. Currently in the familiar stage of feeling completely drowning in the whole thing.
This has been a particularly long one, I suppose. You were just saying before we started, since maybe October, you've been looking closely at this particular story, and we won't discuss its specifics as yet, but what's it like to be dedicated to one magazine story, as it were, for 6 months?
Well, you're never really dedicated to... It's rare that you're dedicated to just one story. So, for instance, I first read about this particular case in September, and then discussed it with my editor shortly after that, and she greenlighted me to look into it. And so I did probably a couple of weeks' work basically trying to... This was a case where the parties involved weren't identified by the court, so it took a couple of weeks just to kind of work out who they were and get in touch with them. And at the same time, I was working on other pieces, and when I came back from holidays in January, I picked up the threads of that story, but then in the interim, I've done a piece which was quite a fast turnaround piece about the filmmaker Martin Butler and his wife Liz Jackson. So there are stories like this that you just have to keep chipping away at them. In this particular case, I had to get my hands on certain documents, and it's taken me 3 months to get them. It's the sort of thing you can... it's the sort of thing that's difficult to do unless you're actually on staff somewhere at a place like the Australian.
What keeps you going during those moments where you might perhaps question yourself or why you are pursuing this particular story, especially when it appears all the entrances are being blocked?
Well, in this particular case, it's a strong conviction that there may have been a miscarriage of justice, and so that's a very strong motivation to pursue this case. And usually those big ones, there is some sort of bigger issue at stake. I did a big piece last year about a mining company in Queensland that was given permission to try out this new U-Butte technology where you set fire to the coal seams underground. You know, a really terrific idea, this one. And you tap the gas. And that was another one that took quite a long time, and it involved getting access to court documents, tracking down a lot of people who used to work for this company, doing corporate searches. But I was just completely fascinated by the story because it involved a company. It involved a certain amount of cover-up, really, of what had been going on, both by the company and, it seemed, by the state government.
That story was called Burning Questions, I believe.
That's right.
About Link Energy?
Yes, it was. So Link Energy used a process called underground coal gasification, which has only ever been really properly rolled out in the Soviet Union for reasons that became pretty obvious once they started, because it's now been described even by the Queensland government as one of the worst environmental disasters in the state's history.
And yet, years before, they were boosting it, weren't they?
The state government was actually a partner in it for a while, and Peter Beattie, the then Premier, was a big booster of it, and that was part of the story, in fact, because it seemed that a lot of government ministers and a lot of...
Is this your dog shaking its tail?
That's my dog trying to shoehorn her way into the interview.
Any mention of Peter Beattie, she's there.
That's right. It seemed like a lot of people had a lot to lose if the full details of this came out.
I was going back through I've obviously known your work quite well over the last 5 or 6 years in particular, since we've known each other reasonably well. I was going back through some of your articles for The Australian last night in preparation for this, and just the sheer breadth of subjects and topics that you have written about, even in the last 5 years, is extraordinary. But you've been doing this for 30 years, I believe, magazine journalism, that is. Let's stick with the idea of talking about ideas. How do they come to you? Do you have any areas that you just don't care about and don't want to write about, or are you open to anything and everything?
I'm pretty open, and I think if you work for a general interest magazine like the Weekend Australian magazine, it's part of the job description that you must be prepared to do a pretty wide variety of stories. And that's one of the things that's attractive about the job, obviously. It keeps you interested. Having said that, there are certain things. I hate interviewing actors. In fact, I generally hate any kind of celebrity stories. I lived overseas in New York from 1986 to 93, and I freelanced during that period, and that involved a lot of... My bread and butter in that period was basically doing interviews with actors and musicians and film directors and celebrity authors. Showbiz stuff. And some of that was great, but I kind of got my fill of it by the time we left New York. I particularly dislike interviewing actors, people who pretend to be someone else, people who pretend to be someone interesting. And look, I guess I would say that I also am not so interested in stories about politics. I have done them over the years. I prefer doing stories about issues-based stuff, like, for instance, the Link Energy story, or I really like doing stories about quote-unquote ordinary people who somehow get caught up in some sort of extraordinary situation and how they deal with that. I always really loved those old school New York journalists like Jimmy Breslin, who used to write a lot of columns where they just interview some ordinary schmo on the street and, capture his story. Like Jimmy Breslin's classic column was the day that John Lennon was shot dead. Everyone was, writing all these wrenching pieces about John Lennon and Yoko and everything, and Jimmy Breslin found the cop who'd found the body, and he was a Beatles fan, and Jimmy Breslin did this portrait of this cop, the guy who came across John Lennon dying. So being in New York actually really kind of awakened me to that style of American journalism, and also I got exposed to a lot of stuff like the New Yorker and Harper's and the Atlantic. And so I do like focusing on stories that are more about a situation involving ordinary people.
Yeah, right. We'll come back to your time in New York and earlier soon, but I think it's fair to say there are times since I've known you where you've been struggling to find ideas, and that's a common trait among any magazine writer. I think you go through periods of high passion and enthusiasm, everything seems to be going right for you, and then periods where you can't seem to find a story that works, or that the planets align and someone wants to talk to you. What do you do in those situations? Do you have any coping strategies that you've learned over the years about that sort of thing?
According to my wife, no, I don't have any coping strategies. You'd think that after 40 years in journalism, you'd kind of learn to deal with that, but to be honest with you, I still struggle with it. At the moment, I'm completely thrown into this story. I'm completely immersed in this story and really sort of obsessed with it, and it's keeping me awake at night, the one I'm working on at the moment. But I know that once it's over, which will be probably in a couple of weeks, I'll be feeling completely spent, and my editor will come in and say, what are you going to do next? Like, what's next? And I find that a colleague of mine was saying the other day that he reckons working for a magazine is like a kind of inverse version of having your period, where there's like 3 or 4 pleasant days and then the rest of the month is just hell, which I thought was quite good. Look, it's I still find that, and also with a job like this, sometimes you're working on stories that for instance, the Martin Butler story that I just did about the filmmaker, I really enjoyed that story. I thought Martin was a great guy, but it wasn't my idea. It was suggested to me, and it was a story that I did need to do something that was more contained, quicker, and so I agreed to do that story. So some of the stories you do because your editor asks you to do them, and they're not necessarily your ideas. And so there are those kind of fill-in jobs, and maybe half of what I do is stuff that I've come up with that I feel really sort of passionate about doing, because some of the ideas you have, of course, don't work out. People just won't talk to you, or you can't get the information you want, or whatever. Do
you have like a document or a backlog of ideas that you've collected over the years that you hope one day to get to, or that you've tried to make work?
I don't think I do. I have a kind of wish list of books that I'd like to write, but in terms of story ideas, I just tend to try and keep moving forward.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, let's go back a bit then. You were born in England, I believe.
Yes.
But raised in Australia?
Yeah, I came out when I was 8. My parents emigrated in the 60s. Grew up in Melbourne, and so I got into journalism when I was about 18. I started writing for music magazines, which, as you know, Andrew, is where many great journalists have started. So I was like writing CD reviews. Well, actually, there were no CDs back then. I was writing album reviews.
Yes.
Then...
Well, hang on. Pause. Were you a big reader before then? You must have had an interest in language to pursue.
Oh yeah, definitely. I was really English was my subject at school, and yeah, I was really interested in writing, and I was a voracious reader.
Were there
of novels? I don't really remember reading newspapers, and I was kind of obsessed with music, so I certainly read music magazines as a teenager, but I'm not sure how much other reading I did of a non-fiction kind.
Were there the writers that you remember from that time who you looked up to, or whose work you particularly enjoyed and thought, I want to be like them?
Well, the thing I remember was the New Musical Express out of England, which had that incredible period in the 70s when Nick Kent and Charles Shaw Murray and Tony Parsons and Julie Burchill were writing for it, and there really was actually something. Lester Bangs, from New York. Those music writers, that was kind of like the halcyon days of music journalism. I don't think there's any doubt about that. It took me a while to really broaden my reading to international journalism, because the truth of it is that I can remember when I first started working at The Age in Melbourne as a young reporter. The papers came in as hard copies and from overseas, and I never saw any of them. I never read the New Yorker or the New York Times. They just weren't available. You'd see sort of copies floating around the office, but for some reason they never, thought about like actually putting them out so that young journalists could actually read them and see what was in them.
So you started music writing at 18, album reviews. How did it progress from there? Who was that with? Who was your first publisher?
So there was a magazine called Rock Australia Magazine, RAM, and I submitted some reviews to them, which I would hate to read today, but the editor, evidently Anthony O'Grady, he just evidently saw something. I think I was still at high school, and I went and had an interview with him in Carlton, which I must have been before I was 18, because I remember my dad drove me to it. And so he started, hiring me to interview bands, which I started doing. And then I heard that there was a job coming up as copy boy at The Truth, which was this absolutely scurrilous tabloid newspaper that had been going for, a century, but at that stage Rupert Murdoch owned it. And so I applied for this job as copy boy, which was like the office boy's job. And I got the job. And the way that Murdoch's operation worked in those days was that you started as an office boy, and then you got a cadetship, and you were trained in-house, and you sort of spent a year on each of the publications. In my case, being down in Melbourne, that meant I spent a year on Truth, where my greatest achievement was the story Headmaster on 57 Sex Charges. And
what a classic of the genre.
Yeah. And then I went to TV Week, where you just actually spent your whole time interviewing actors from Cop Shop and various other crap.
That's where your hatred of interviewing actors began.
Although one of the great byproducts of that was I had to go to Countdown, the pop music TV show, on most weekends just in case anything happened, and I was there the weekend that Iggy Pop appeared and drunk out of his mind. I don't know if you've ever seen the footage of him singing "I'm Bored" on Countdown, but it's one of the seminal moments of music for me, because I've never seen anyone miming with so much, raw power. So I had a year on TV Week, and then
So what year was that?
I'm thinking it was like 79. And then I ended up as a cadet on the Australian in their Melbourne bureau, and then from there I became as they used to call it, a D-grade reporter, and then I managed to talk my way into a job at The Age, and that's when things started to get more interesting, because The Age the Melbourne Bureau of News Limited was a bit of a kind of a sort of forgotten outpost in the whole
Sydney-centric
News Limited sort of ecosphere at the time, and so you just didn't get a wide range of work. But at the Age, there was a lot more potential to pursue stuff you were interested in.
So during your cadetship, you learned things like shorthand, perhaps, or like note-taking and quickly turning copy around and that sort of thing?
The News Limited cadet program was really good, actually, because, so I went from high school straight into journalism. I didn't go to university at all, and so you kind of learned on the job. They taught you shorthand, and they taught you all the kind of basics of news reporting, and how to get all the information into a news report. And they took you out, and I remember we interviewed Jeff Kennett, in 1979 or something, when he was an up-and-coming MP. So it was really sort of quite a good program, and I feel like I came out of that fairly well equipped, and then I went to the Age, and I was a general news reporter for a while. And then I edited their, quote unquote edited, I was completely floundering, but I sort of somehow put together their Friday entertainment guide for about 6 months. And then I got a job as a feature writer. And that's when I first started feature writing, unless you count I was doing music journalism all through this period. Freelancing, yeah. And so I was writing long features, music features. But I do remember the first time I tried to write a feature that wasn't about music, and it was actually, for some reason, I was in Sydney, and it was about the block in Redfern, and just remember feeling completely at sea, or completely overwhelmed by the task of structuring this piece and working out what to say.
Did you have any guys or mentors at that time who you could ask for help?
There was an editor at... there were two editors at The Age who were really crucial for me. One was, when I was a news reporter, there was a guy called Robert Haupt, who unfortunately died quite young, and he was really encouraging of my writing, and he himself was a really a writer and editor of quite a bit of stature. But the most important guy was a guy called Russell Skelton, who is now... at the ABC, he's the head of their fact-check unit, and he was my features editor, and he really kind of pushed me outside my comfort zone, and he assigned me to do stuff that I really felt that I was incapable of doing, and was, scared the shit out of me. And I discovered that actually, he got me to do a profile of Lionel Murphy, the High Court judge who was embroiled in scandal at the time. And Lionel Murphy was a High Court judge, so he wasn't going to talk to me. So I had to write a profile of someone who wasn't going to talk to me.
The right around, as it's known. Yeah.
And, I'm not saying it's a Pulitzer Prize-winning piece or anything, but I made a pretty good fist of it, and I did a much better job of it than I thought I was going to do. And so Russell was really instrumental in making me feel like, hey, I actually can do this.
Was it through what he said, or just the way that he treated you, or kind of a combination of all of that? Or his direct feedback to you, or?
Yeah, he was really encouraging. He told me, he kind of said to me, "Listen, you can do this. You can pull this off." And he did give me good constructive feedback on writing. And he just seemed to know how to just push me a little bit outside of my comfort zone, just far enough that I would come out of it feeling like I'd really pulled something off, know.
And a bit further each time.
Yeah, that's right.
And that's where the skills develop.
Yeah, well, exactly. I never went to journalism school per se. I never, went to university. So a lot of this was learning on the job, which I think, there's something to be said for it. I feel like I went into journalism without any illusions. I think a lot of people these days maybe they come out of university and they've done a lot of study and they've studied great journalism, and their head's full of these ideas that they're going to kind of go out there and, you know, break open the next Watergate in their first year or something. Whereas I just kind of slogged away for 4 years and sort of, you know, slogged my way up the food chain.
Did you have a goal in mind or a place that you wanted to be, or were you just happy to be learning on the job?
No, I definitely had ambitions, because by the time I'd worked as a feature writer for a couple of years on The Age, I wanted to go overseas. I wanted to try my hand overseas. Part of the problem with Australia is, you know, every town's a 1 or 2 newspaper town, and so it's hard to sort of see a career path just in Australia. So at The Age, you know, I guess I'd been there for 4 years or something, and I'd done maybe 5. It was 86, and I just decided, we'd been to my now wife and I had been to New York the year before, and I just absolutely just loved New York. Just like, you know, within seconds of being there, I thought, I want to live in this place. And so we decided, like a crazy idea in retrospect, like, let's just move to New York and see what happens.
What was your wife doing for work? Oh, so your partner at the time doing for work?
She was a chef.
All right.
Thank God, because, you know, she kept us alive for the first 6 months. And
that was a big decision to make. Like,
yeah.
So what year is that? The 86?
That's 86. So I was 28 by this stage. So I'd been a journalist for 10 years, you know.
So you had some skills, you had some chops, and you wanted to see if you could prove yourself in the biggest market for journalism in the world, or in the English-speaking world at least.
Yeah, and also by that stage, I of course had been reading Tom Wolfe, Jimmy Breslin, people like that. I'd, you know, Hunter Thompson. I'd read all the new journalism stuff. I'd read Michael Herr's Dispatches. I was really just swept away by all that 70s American journalism, that narrative journalism that used novelistic techniques.
Yeah, talk a little about new journalism. That topic might have come up in previous episodes, but what's your definition, or how would you define new journalism as it was back then?
Well, all those labels are sort of just convenient, you know, but there was this school of magazine journalists in the 70s in America, like Tom Wolfe, who really just blew apart the whole model of the sort of very rigid conventional structure of a story, where you kind of open and you give the reader the facts and you lay it all out in this logical form. And they use novelistic techniques like, you know, sort of narratives that you just had to go with to find out what was going on. You know, the stories would open at some oblique angle. Like Tom Wolfe, you would use all this jazzy language, and Hunter Thompson, of course, just wrote himself into everything he wrote. He was like this kind of coke-snorting, you know, rum-guzzling maniac who was the central character in every story he wrote. So that a lot of these people had different techniques, you know. And I really liked some of the really old traditional journalism, like, for instance, Jimmy Breslin, the columnist I mentioned earlier, a much more conventional writer, but still a guy who could really beautifully capture a scene, and wrote about small characters.
Did you try and give that sort of writing a go when you were at The Age with your features, like trying to follow some of those devices?
I did.
And were you slapped down, or the
I wasn't slapped down, but I just didn't pull it off. You know, like I did this story about street gangs. You know, that was my first, I think, real stab at that, where I went out and I was trying to do a lot more street reporting towards the end at The Age, where just observational stuff. So I did this thing on street gangs. There were a couple of gangs in Melbourne at the time, the Lebanese Tigers, and there was the Sandy Boys down in Sandringham. And so I kind of hung out with those guys and tried to write about them. But I was kind of half successful. But I was very interested in pursuing that sort of stuff.
Mm-hmm. So you moved to New York, and what was your approach to get in touch with editors and to try and get published in certain publications? How did you go about that?
I was just, in retrospect, kind of don't know what I was thinking I was doing. We arrived in New York, we had nowhere to live, and I'd sort of just cashed in all my superannuation and holiday pay. And so we kind of found a hotel room, and then we found a sublet, and eventually we actually found an apartment. Like I say, my wife got a job in a restaurant, which was, saved our bacon. But that's right, I had a retainer to write about Wall Street for the Times on Sunday. Wall Street, a subject I knew nothing about. And so I wrote this column that was kind of like, they paid me $100 a week to sort of do a summary of what happened on Wall Street that week. And I was doing some stuff for the Australian papers, obviously, the freelance pieces. But the thing that really cracked it for me was I managed to score an interview with Elmore Leonard, the novelist, and I sent my story to Time Out in London, and it turned out that Time Out in London was run by an Australian guy, Don Attio, and he really liked the story, and he called me up, and it's like this Australian voice from London, and we just clicked, and he said, look, we don't have anyone in New York, so if you want to do stuff for us. And that was just a huge breakthrough for me, because one of the problems in New York is, you go to people and say, look, I'd like to write a feature about, Quentin Tarantino for the Sydney Morning Herald, and they go, what is that? And it's just like they just had no interest really in Australia at all. But if you went and said, look, I can get a 3 or 4 page feature into Time Out in London, they would listen to you and deal with you, And so suddenly I got access to people like Quentin Tarantino and writers and, various people who I could write about. And Time Out, the guy who ran Time Out, launched a new magazine which ultimately failed, but it was called 2020, and it was more general interest. And I began doing sort of street reporting things for them, or more, sort of broad street reporting type stuff for them. I remember I went out with some city marshals who impound cars, that have got too many parking fines on them, which is seems to be one of the most dangerous jobs in New York based on my experience of it. So I was doing things like that.
Right. So that Elmore Leonard example, you would have... You did the interview, you wrote it up, you typed it up on a typewriter, I presume?
Yeah, I was using a typewriter.
Printed it out and mailed it to London?
Yeah.
Because this is pre-internet, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And then you probably waited for a few weeks and then...
Yeah, well, that's my memory, a couple of weeks and the phone rings and, it's London. I do remember when I got off the phone, I just jumped into the air. I did literally punch the air because I just knew that was a really big break, to be able to sort of become a regular correspondent for Time Out in London was going to be really a significant sort of boost for me. It was going to give me access that I couldn't get.
Were you prepared for how hard you have to hustle as a freelancer on moving to this new city, new country?
Look, the thing was, there's just endless stories in America. It's just an embarrassment of riches, really, And so it depended what you wanted to pick and choose to write about. And at that time, the magazine industry was really kind of booming. You got paid pretty good rates. I mean, Time Out put me on a retainer, and so the only thing was that to get into magazines in America, that was a real hustle. There were just great journalists everywhere in America. I remember getting in a taxi once and talking to this guy, and it turned out I think his name was TJ Maxx, and he'd just written this book about the Irish gangs of Hell's Kitchen, and he's driving a cab, and this book had rave reviews, and I'm thinking, oh fuck, this guy's already at a kind of a level that I sort of aspire, that I would have aspired to, and he's still driving a cab, So there were a lot of great writers, needless to say, magazine writers, and I never really... I did do some work for American magazines and American papers. You know, I got into the Washington Post, I got into the New York Times, I got into the LA Times, but I never really cracked that New Yorker, Harper's, Atlantic, that lofty upper sphere of the whole thing. I just found you couldn't cold pitch those people. They sort of had to know who you were, or you had to send them a finished piece.
Yeah, right. So they had their favourites, their stables of writers, and some Australian bloke who no one had heard of was not exactly at the top of the pile.
Yeah, exactly. And also, New York is just full of bullshitters, you know, and so there was this whole thing about talking yourself up. I remember I submitted this story about the funk bassist Bootsy Collins to Musician magazine, and the guy really liked it and called me in and we chatted, and he goes, you know, so are you a musician? And I said, he goes, so do you play? And like, I fool around on guitar, but I said, no, you know, I don't. And he goes, oh, right, okay. And I thought, I should have just lied. You know?
Yeah, you told the truth.
Yeah.
In New York.
And like, he didn't run the piece and he didn't call me back. You know, it's just like, it was one of those moments where I thought, you just should have bullshitted. That's what people do in this town.
What did your partner think of this freelance writing caper? Six months into living in New York, she was...
Oh, look, she got a really good job in this bistro where all the Madonna and bloody Andy Warhol ate. And so, you know, we had a great life. We had a great time in New York, you know, and we actually had a comfortable life there, which was surprising until the end when the recession hit. The stock market crashed and a lot of mags closed, like 2020 closed down, and it became much more difficult. And we'd had a kid, we'd had a baby in New York, which cost us a lot of money, and so it got really difficult at that point. But basically, we had a really good run, and I got to meet a lot of really great writers through my work. You know, I met Tom Wolfe, I met Studs Terkel, I met Hubert Selby. And I got to, you know, that was fantastic to meet writers that I really admired.
And your partner was always supportive of you hustling and trying to, you know, be ambitious and try to get into these magazines and picking you up when you were down, those kinds of things, or were you fairly self-contained?
Yeah, I don't know, actually. It'd be interesting to talk to her. I don't remember... I remember that period as being exciting, and although the celebrity stuff did start to become a grind, you know, you'd go to these junkets in Hollywood where you're one of 10 journalists sitting around a table listening to Winona Ryder crap on about her latest psychodrama, you know. That became tiresome, but mostly I found the work really stimulating, and also I did feel like my work was really progressing, you know, and I was getting, in the end I was doing stories for the Sunday Times magazine and the Independent in London, and they were quite, you know, challenging stories, and it was great to be published in those sort of publications. So I felt like I don't remember having too many kind of down moments, and also there was just an endless amount to write about in the United States. You know, that whole thing of scratching around for an idea just, you know, was never in my consciousness.
Yeah, right. When did book writing cross your mind? Or maybe we're getting the chronology mixed up. So you left New York in 1993?
Yeah, but book writing, I have a tragic story there.
Yeah, go on. I'd love to hear it, as would the listeners.
So, just before we decided to leave, you know, we had a small child. Susan kind of wanted to come home, and I was a little bit 50-50, but the hustle of it was really starting to get to me, and it was clear I couldn't get a green card, and I just thought, you know, okay, maybe it's time to go. So the last job I did, in fact, was the Sunday Times magazine rang me and said, listen, Leonard Cohen's got his novels are being re-released and a book of his lyrics is coming out. This is 93. We're going to fly you to LA and meet him. and interview him. And so I was flown to LA and went to this recording studio, and there's Leonard, who I've always, of course, like really admired, and he's mixing some album, and we go and have dinner, and he's just thoroughly charming and very amusing. And then he says, like, why don't we keep going at my place? And so I drive to his place, and I spend like, I don't know, an hour and a half at his apartment. He's showing me all of his notebooks and sketches of naked women and all this kind of stuff. It was just one of those great interviews where you meet someone you really admire and you just like him, and he's just thoroughly engaging. Anyway, the piece ran, and I think it was published after we left New York. We flew into Sydney, and we were living in a flat in Bondi. And I think I'd been home about a week in Australia, and the phone rang, and it's Bloomsbury Publishers in London, and they want to commission me to do a book about Leonard Cohen, which is something I would have killed to have done, quite frankly. Because, he's such a rich character, and his life covers from the Beats in the 50s, right through, well, as we know, to today now. But I was back in Australia, and I'd taken on this job working for The Age out of Sydney, and, I was thousands of miles away from Leonard Cohen. And so I tried to sort of contact Cohen's office and see if he would cooperate and work out some way of doing it. But in the end, I had to say, no, I can't do it, which just killed me, actually.
Wow.
Because I hadn't written a book, and I knew that a biography of Leonard Cohen would be a great first book. It would be published around the world.
Yeah.
And so this other guy got to write it, and for years afterwards, I would encounter this guy's book in shops, and it would
a dagger to your heart.
That's right. It would just be like a blow to the head.
Did you read it?
No, I didn't. And funnily enough, his book, I don't know how good it was, but his book was totally eclipsed years later by the Sylvie Simmons biography, which is apparently fantastic. And in retrospect, I thought, yeah, of course, it would take a woman to really write the great book about Leonard Cohen, I reckon. So that's how I comfort myself these days.
Wow, okay. So back to The Age, 1993 or 94 perhaps?
Yeah, so I'm back. Well, we're back in Australia. It's actually came back at the end of 93, so it's 94, and I was working in Sydney for The Age, which was not really a job that worked, because it was like the inverse of when I was working for The Australian in Melbourne. They kind of...
That's the one Sydney paid.
Yeah. So I did that for about 6 months, and then I managed to get myself onto the Sydney Morning Herald, and I became a news reporter there and then a feature writer, and I started doing some quite interesting stuff. That's when I first started reporting about repressed memory, this phenomenon of people recovering memories from their childhood and believing that they'd been sexually abused. That became like a huge focus for me. I was completely fascinated by that story, and I ended up writing, that was my first book, Talk of the Devil, which came out of a lot of my reporting for the Herald.
So that must have been well received by your editors, and they encouraged you to keep going, and you did multiple reports.
Yeah, that's right. I was doing, I did become a bit obsessed about it, to the point where it began to annoy them, and they kind of had to prise me off that topic after my book came out. But look, it was just an amazing phenomenon. Why would anyone want to believe that their father had raped them when they were 5 if it didn't actually happen? I found that, and not only that, but why do so many psychiatrists and police and judges and lawyers buy into this whole thing, and believe it too? I found that I sat in on trials where the memories that these people were coming up with were quite obviously phantasms. They were just, it was just impossible for these things to have actually happened to them. They were talking about, these were people who were talking about being gang raped by Satanists when they were 4 years old, and yet there'd never been any history of them going to the doctor or having any sort of physical injuries. And so I was, and men were going to prison too. Men were being convicted on the basis of repressed memory. So I kind of poured all of that into Talk of the Devil, which sold by the dozens. And,
which I have not read. No. I have asked you several times over the years to give me a copy. Now that I'm in your home, please give me a copy. Do you have a box under the staircase?
I do have a box actually upstairs.
Thank
you. So I did that. I did that book in '96.
So it's sold by the dozens.
Yeah.
You may be using some comedic effect there, but what happened? Do you think? Why was it not well received?
Look, the subject matter is very dark. And nearly every woman I've known who's tried to read that book has found it really difficult to get through, because it's about. A lot of these people were women. The vast majority of people who are recovering these memories are women, and so it's sort of about the female subconscious, and it's about those deep fears that women have, which are fed, of course, by popular culture or religion. A lot of these people who were recovering these satanic memories were religious people, for instance. So, it was just a very dark book. Look, I'm pretty proud of it, and it was also an investigative work, because I was looking at how these ideas spread. It was really about a kind of a contagious hysteria, really, because in the end all these people who work in sexual assault counselling really believed that there were these satanic cults everywhere, and they had to kind of explain why no one had ever found any evidence of them.
So they were essentially projecting some of their own experiences or their own imaginations onto the situation? Well,
not only that, but their own political beliefs too, because a lot of people who work in sexual assault counselling are very committed feminists, and so one of the foundation beliefs about in sexual assault counselling at that time, and to some extent to this day, was that women and children don't lie about this stuff. They don't make this. No one makes this stuff up. So if they say it happened, it must have happened, and that's, of course, a completely erroneous viewpoint. The fact of the matter is, people do make this stuff up. And how often that happens, it's difficult to determine, but they do it for all sorts of reasons. Some people do it because they've just got deep psychological problems. Some people do it because a therapist suggested to them that it must have happened and put them in a hypnotic state, and they quote unquote remembered it. Some people do it to get compensation money, and some people do it for malice. Some people do it in family court proceedings. So it was interesting in that it had a whole social and political dimension as well, because you had religious people pushing it, saying, see what we told you, there are these Satanists out there, and look what they're doing, they're killing children, and then you had all these feminists saying, well, we believe it must be happening because all these women are saying it's been happening.
Was it difficult to report on and write about? Was it hard to get your head around how to frame the topic, or to put yourself there as the presumably objective narrator?
Well, it was one of those topics where, objectivity became difficult, because I became convinced that it was a really big problem. You just couldn't have people being prosecuted in court and potentially sentenced to years in prison on the basis of a psychiatric, memory recovery technique that was really dubious. And so I became a widely disliked figure certainly in the field of sexual assault counselling, and I was seen as a guy who was sympathising with paedophiles, and I in fact was accused of being a paedophile myself by Franca Arena, the New South Wales Member of Parliament. To her credit, she did accuse me to my face, but that was the kind of atmosphere, if you were raising doubts about the stories women and children were telling, then you were a kind of figure of suspicion.
That seems like a pretty tricky area to write in. Were there times where you wondered what the hell you were doing and wanted to walk away from it, or were you just captivated throughout?
I got pretty engrossed in it, but I was glad that I did walk away from it in the end, because I was at the Sydney Morning Herald at the time, and I actually wanted just to pursue that story to the exclusion of everything after I wrote my book, because I was fascinated by the fact that all these people who are supposed to be objective medical and legal professionals had got caught up in this, what I considered to be hysteria, and I thought it was a really significant story about how dangerous ideas can get disseminated. But my editors were pretty happy for me to stop writing about it after a while, and which I now understand, and so they kind of dragged me back in and sort of chained me to my desk and gave me various more mundane topics to write about. Luckily, at that point, I got a job on Good Weekend, which was the Herald's magazine, which was then being edited by a really great editor, Fenella Suter, and that sort of was the next step for me, because then I was doing really quite long magazine pieces again.
This is mid-90s or late 90s?
Yeah, this would have been late 90s, probably 98, I would imagine.
So from what I've heard, Good Weekend at that time was running quite lengthy pieces. Are we talking like 8,000 words, longer?
8,000 would have been unusual. I remember my colleague David Laser did a profile of the broadcaster Alan Jones, and I think that was 7,500, and I think that was the longest piece we ran. But you could push it out to 5,000 if you begged and pleaded.
Were you more comfortable writing long? Did you prefer that to trying
to... absolutely. Like one of the things I find most difficult about this job is trying to fit a very complex story into even 4,000 words. I think is kind of tricky, Like I'm writing a story at the moment about this criminal case, and it's a very complicated case, and there's two sides to it that I have to fit in there, and then there's this bigger issue around the role that various professionals played in this case, and I've just done a first draft, and it was just murder trying to get it under 5,000 words. And that when I read those long New Yorker pieces, I just so envious that the journalist gets 10, 12,000 just to let the story unfold. The stories have this sort of sedate kind of opening a lot of the time. They just sort of slowly draw you in, whereas there's this necessity with what I do of like you got to kind of somehow, I feel anyway, hit the reader at the beginning and like, this is what this story is about, and so you do get into a little bit of a formula which I'm very aware of. There's the kind of setup in the opening of the story, the opening 10 pars, that sort of says to the reader, hey, this is what this story's about,
Yeah.
But it's hard to kind of break out of that, because you have to, it has to all be condensed,
That Good Weekend job, was that would have been and still is now, as is your job, one of the plum feature writing jobs in the country? Were you happy to be doing that alongside people like David Laser?
I was totally ecstatic, yeah, because also I'd heard Fenella was a great editor, which proved to be true. She was really someone who knew writing, and she would go through your stuff line by line, that never happens on newspapers, I mean, the common thing on newspapers is you hand something in, it's not great, I mean, sometimes you hand stuff in and you think, wow, that I'm really happy with that. But a lot of the time you're like, I just didn't have time, and I know there's a few sloppy bits in there. And they, you have to go, yeah, that's great, mate, thanks. And
on to the next one.
Yeah.
See you tomorrow.
But with Fenella, the stuff would come back and there'd be red lines through it and question marks and all of that kind of stuff. And that really, helped me develop a lot.
Well, let's stick with that. What makes, besides what you just said, what makes a good magazine story editor? What do you like to hear and see as a magazine writer from your editor?
I think, number one, I think they have to have good ideas and recognise good ideas. and Fenella and my current editor Christine Middap definitely fit that mould. They're very good at generating ideas and reading stories and seeing stuff that's around and suggesting ideas. And it takes patience to be a magazine editor. Some of these stories take a long time, and so you're sort of asking a lot of leeway in newspaper terms. It's very common. I mean, just the other day, one of the news journos wandered past our section and made some droll remark about how things in the luxury lounge, or words to that effect.
Yes.
There's a much more unkind descriptions, the sleep ward or whatever, but there's all these jokes about how long we take because we get 4 weeks to work on a story, whoopee. But sometimes they take a lot longer than 4 weeks. Sometimes you're just chipping away at them, like this one I'm on at the moment. And so, a really good magazine editor, I do think has to have that confidence that you're going to come through with something and just give you leeway on it. But also, I think any long feature, the thing that you have to labour over is structure and how much do you tell the reader and how much do you hold back. A long feature has to have some surprises in it, obviously, just to jolt the reader awake every now and then. So the structure of those pieces is something that I think most of us spend a lot of time, wrestling with and probably tearing our hair out most over. How do I let this story unfold and how am I going to end it and all that stuff. And so I really value sort of feedback on that, whether the structure works.
What do you wish short form writers or people like that news journo who walked past and had the droll remark, what do you wish that those people understood about the kind of work that you do?
Well, that's the thing, all those people. I mean, it's a jealousy thing in a way, I think, because most of those people would love some extra time. Obviously, they're just churning stuff out every day. I sit next to a guy who writes a business gossip column every day. I'd be dead by the end of the week.
Who's that?
Will Glasgow. He and his co-writer, they have to, I don't know how many words they write a day, and it has to be like inside dope from the world of business, that would just kill me. But
it's a different way of thinking.
It's a different way of thinking, But the thing is, whenever I do news stories, I always think, oh man, it's so great. Just like it's 15 paragraphs and it's just bang, bang, bang. This happened, and then she said this, and then he said, no, that's not right. And then, and then this happened 3 weeks ago, which is why you're reading this story, and then you write it out. And it's great to do those. You just realise how formulaic that sort of thing is. And so I do, when people make jokes, like I'm used to those jokes, but when news reporters make those jokes, I always kind of feel like saying, mate, if you think it's easy to write a 4,500 word feature, just have a crack at it one time and let me know how you go.
Yeah.
But I never do say that because I like to have a peaceful relationship with my colleagues.
Right. Okay. So how long were you with Good Weekend, and any memorable stories that come to mind during that time?
Yeah, I was at Good Weekend for, I must have been 7 years. Look, I think the most memorable story I did was when Fenella sent me up to the Northern Territory to profile David Gulpilil, the Indigenous actor, and I went up there, and he lived on Ramingining, this remote community in Arnhem, and so you fly in on a light plane, and he had these two minders, Shane and Wayne, who kind of look after him. And they pick me up and they drive me. And Gulpilil's living in a humpy in Ramingining, and they say, look, we're going to go out and hunt crocodiles tonight. So I'm like, right, okay, yeah, sure. And I'm thinking, this is not going to happen, like, just remain calm, because obviously this is just a completely insane idea. But so we get in this ute, which had like holes in the floor that dust came through, and we drive for miles and miles to this swamp, the Arafura. I think it's called the Arafura Swamp, and it's where the sort of sea sort of seeps in. And then there's this tinny, like a boat, on a trailer at this sort of outstation place, which they hook up to this bashed up ute. And then we drive like just straight into this bushland and just smash our way through it, like sort of knocking down trees and stuff. And by this stage, it's about 11 o'clock in the evening, and it's dark. And they haul this is Gulpilil and his two minders and me, and they haul this tinny off the back of the trailer and put it into the swamp, and we set off to hunt crocs. And Gulpilil's got a harpoon, and they've got a rifle. And my job is to hold the torch on the water so we can see the red lights of their eyes, of which there are fucking dozens. Right? So I'm on a swamp at night in a tinny with 3 mad people, and we're going to actually capture a crocodile. And Gulpilil has this harpoon, and the head of the harpoon has a rope attached to it. And so he thrusts, we go right up next to this croc, and he thrusts this harpoon into its somewhere, and it immediately, of course, is not happy and goes into a death roll and starts rolling, which wraps the rope around it. Yep. So I think he might have stabbed it just behind the head, because the rope sort of wraps around it. And then he hauls it up to the surface, and they shoot it with the rifle through the head, and it goes still. And they then haul it over the side of the tinny with the rope that's attached to it. And I'm thinking, the crocodile's dead at least. But then they say, no, it's not dead. And like, apparently a bullet through the head only just sort of stuns them momentarily. And we've got to sever its spinal cord, right? So they wrap a rope around its jaws to shut them, to tie them shut. And then Gulpilil pulls out this enormous dagger and proceeds to just like hack through the back of this croc's neck, which is, its head is hanging over the side of our tinny, like chipping away at a block of concrete, And suddenly the croc just emits this most primeval friggin' roar, and it's come back into, it's woken up, having felt its spinal cord being severed by Australia's greatest Indigenous actor. And anyway, suffice to say, he did actually manage to hack his way and kill this croc, which they then hauled into the tinny. It was huge. It was almost as long as the tinny. And we did it again. We did another one. And then we hauled we parked the boat on the side of the swamp, and he hauled the crocs out, and we then had to walk back to... By this stage, we're way up the swamp, and we've got to walk back to the car. And I'm thinking, like, we're in a croc-infested swamp in the middle of the night. What are we doing? Like, how are we going to walk back to the car? And Gulpilil tears this piece of paperbark, a strip of paperbark, a great wad of it off, and pulls out a lighter and lights it, and just holds it up and brandishes it as a torch. And he then sort of goes over to this paperbark tree and sets fire to its trunk. And then he kind of walks 20 metres and sets fire to another one, and then another one. And he lights this path through the swamp with flames. And we're just walking through this swamp with all these flames just going up around us. It was
while dragging crocodiles.
Well, no, we left the crocs behind. We're going to come back and get them in the morning. And it was the most incredible scene, and Gulpilil's this sort of like live figure. You know what he looks like. He's just the most incredible looking guy, and he's sort of dancing around in the flames and going, come on, this way. it was just the most incredible. It's the most incredible assignment I've ever been on, quite frankly.
It's times like that you think, wow, isn't it great to be a magazine journalist?
Look, it was. I came back from that job and I wrote that story, I think, in about 2 days flat. In fact, I had to write it because I remember there was some sort of deadline on it. And so it had to be in 3 days. And I just sat down, I just poured out of me. That was just great. That was one of the best assignments and one of the best pieces I ever wrote.
Is that available online by any chance? I'd love to link to it.
I don't think it is, actually. And, I don't have a clean PDF copy of it. And I recently rang Fairfax and said, look, I'd really like to get, some really quality PDF copies of stories I wrote for Good Weekend. And they said, oh, no, we chucked all the electronic versions of those pages out.
What? Really?
Can you believe it?
I can't believe it.
Yeah,
surely
I couldn't
not.
believe it either. I said, well, surely you've got electronic reproductions of those pages from Good Weekend somewhere in your system. And they said, oh, no, we don't. You'd have to just photocopy the hard copy of the magazine. Incredible, isn't it?
If that is the case and they are lost to time, that is depressing.
I've made a couple of inquiries at Fairfax about that because I didn't believe it the first time someone told me. But I've since been told by someone in fairly good authority in their editorial library system that they just don't exist. So the only so I imagine that the actual pages of the mag are not available online. You could probably get the text, but you wouldn't be able to actually see the magazine reproduced online. It's crazy, isn't it?
Yes. All right. Well, somewhere around there you cross paths with the Wolf.
That came later though because I went from Good Weekend to the Australians magazine. Now let me get this right actually. So that would have been... Actually, you're right. It was around that time, around the time I left Good Weekend, that I had an agent at the time and she put me onto the Wolf Project, and so this was a story about a German warship in World War One that had been a kind of a pirate ship, and the Germans had sent it out in the war, and its mission basically was to come out to Australia and create havoc, and it was to attack civilian ships, trading ships, and create panic and lay mines outside. And the idea was just to totally disrupt the supply chains.
And it wasn't spotted for quite some time. Or
no,
it wasn't
spotted at all. Really, it was at sea for 16 months, and it never pulled into a port to refuel. It simply stole. It was a coal-fired ship, and it simply attacked other ships and stole their coal. But the thing about it was, the thing that was fascinating about the story was, because it was a lot of the ships it was attacking were freighters, they were civilian ships, so they weren't actually allowed to kill anyone. They had to actually they had a light plane, so they'd send this little plane over, which would drop a sort of bomb near it and scare everyone, and then a message would be dropped down saying, you've been raided, pull over, we won't harm you, and the German captain would take everyone off the ship, take all its coal and food and stuff, and then just sink the thing and then just keep going.
With prisoners on board.
Yeah, so as his voyage progressed, he just accumulated hundreds and hundreds of prisoners, and they were from all different nationalities. There ended up being about 400 of them, and they all had to live with this pretty big German crew of about 300, and so of course they all started to fraternise and become quite chummy and had Christmas dinner together, and so the book was really about this weird voyage and that flung all these people together, and they had to learn to live with each other.
The research behind it was done by a guy named Peter Honan, is that right?
Yeah, Peter's great uncle had been one of the prisoners, and so the story was a bit of family law that he had always been fascinated by. And he was a lawyer, and he'd done this. he had the idea of making a documentary about it because it was a very little known slice of history. And he'd done a prodigious amount of research. He used a lot of his kind of lawyer skills, and he tracked down a lot of documentary records. And it turned out a lot of the prisoners had written books or accounts, that had sort of only ever sold 10 copies, but he managed to track them down. And also the Germans had cameras, and so all these hundreds of photos had been taken on board. And so he had this incredible archive of stuff. But the film never happened, and he agreed, once he realised he could trust me, to just hand over the archive to me, and I wrote the book based on it. And so we were billed as co-authors. And that book actually was really quite successful here, and it also got published overseas, but it didn't do so well overseas, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary bit of historical journalism, I suppose, the way that you have used these accounts that, as you say, were written and photographs that were taken to reconstruct something that happened decades before you were born and which had been forgotten largely to time. So it's an amazing achievement. Like, I read it maybe around the time I first met you, or somewhere around there, 2010. It came out in 2009, I believe.
That's right, yeah.
It came out 2010, and I read it around then, and it's phenomenal, so highly recommend.
Thank you.
That listeners check out The Wolf. It's sold quite well. You're telling me privately recently. What are the most recent sales figures?
Look, I think it did about 26,000 in Australia, which is, really good. And I think it surprised the publisher, actually. We had been thinking that, it would be a big seller in Germany, but we're yet to be able to find a German publisher who'll publish it. But look, I found that thing of the historical research and writing about historical events really incredibly satisfying and interesting, and I've been sort of scratching around for another historical topic really ever since then, but I just haven't been able to find one that's... The problem with non-fiction writing in Australia, as I'm sure you've discovered, is that the advances are very low, and if your subject matter isn't sellable overseas, then you're looking at a limited time that you've got a limited amount of money, and so that whole thing of spending 3 years on a book is not possible unless you've got some other source of income. And so that's the tricky thing about non-fiction here. I mean, even that book, we got advances from the US and the UK, which of course Peter and I split, and so we got quite a bit of money up front. But the book took 3 years all up. The proposal took me. The proposal was like 95 pages long.
Oh wow!
Yeah, it was really. My agent said, she wanted a real disbuster proposal, and so I kind of wrote a condensed version of the book. And so that took, I think, from memory, that took about a year to do just on its own.
Wow!
Not full time, obviously,
yeah.
but off and on.
Wow. What was your research? I mean, a lot of the research was already there. How did you go about organising it all and then deciding how to structure the book itself? I'm presuming you had documents laid out everywhere and in boxes and files. And what was your compilation method like as a writer for that project?
Yeah, there was a lot, because Peter had done a great job, but when I arrived at his house, the files were in just complete chaos. I mean, it was just, they were in these plastic tubs under his house. It was just, I couldn't believe it. It was, I just didn't know where to start. And to this day, I'm not entirely sure I got to see all of them. He was always going, I think I've got one of those, archival things somewhere under my bed. I'll go and have a look. But yes, there were certain things like he got the captain's log, which recorded every single day of the voyage. And he got this stuff out of the German archives that was really super handy in terms of constructing the narrative. I mean, part of it too was like anything like that, there was a certain mythology had built up around this voyage. Some of the accounts that had been written of the voyage were a little bit fanciful. And you could see that people had gilded the lily, and so you had to thread your way through that and try and work out, what was true and what was really kind of people over egging the pudding a bit. The thing I found too was that by this stage, you could get a lot of stuff off the internet. Trove. I discovered Trove this way, the National Library's digitised newspaper archive. I mean, that was just like a huge resource. The Argus is completely digitised, which was one of the biggest newspapers in Australia at that time. And a lot of the local little regional papers are digitised too. So you could find lots of stuff online, I found.
Mm-hmm.
It was a great project. I totally enjoyed that. So I did that. We published that in 2009, and by that stage I was a couple of years into my job at the Weekend Australian, where I'd been hired to be a staff writer.
Yeah. So how were you juggling that towards the end of the writing thing? Were you part time in the magazine, or were you working on the book on weekends, or on book leave or something like that? I
was part-time 3 days a week at the magazine, actually for the first, I think, 4 or 5 years. But I pretty much had the book written, I think, from memory. If not written, it was certainly 3/4 written by the time. Oh, actually, no, that's not true. I think when I first started at the Oz, I was working on the book fairly intensively. Look, it's all a bit of a blur, to be quite honest, but I somehow got it out.
I just realised when your neighbours have started whippersnippering you,
I?
That would be great, yes.
Yeah, shall I shut this door?
For our listeners' benefits, that would be ideal. Alright, so coming towards the end, there was a particular profile of which I believe you're quite proud, which was published in 2009, I want to say, and it was of a man named Julian Assange.
Yeah.
And I was going back through my emails and I realised that was the first time I contacted you, because in 2010 I was looking at writing about Mr. Assange and had found mention of your article for the Australian magazine, but it was not online at that time for some reason. So I contacted you and said, "Hey Richard, I'm looking into Mr. Assange, can you please send me a copy of your article?" And you very kindly did. But talk a little about this profile of Julian Assange, which I believe was the first major one in Australia.
It was. Yeah, so one of our sub-editors came up to me one day and said, have you heard of this guy, Julian Assange? And I sort of said, yeah, vaguely. The WikiLeaks guy. And I said, yeah, vaguely. At this point, this was quite a bit before Assange had become internationally well known. He hadn't released the collateral murder video at this point. Philip Adams was our columnist, and Philip was one of the founding board members of WikiLeaks, and he had mentioned Assange in one of his columns, and this sub-editor, Lee Butterworth, came up to me and said, "This guy Assange sounds really interesting. He's living overseas, he's like an expat Australian, he's been leaking this stuff. I think Assange had leaked the manual from the staff manual from Guantanamo Bay and a couple of other things, And so I started just digging around, and Assange was not living in Australia at the time, so you couldn't just ring him up. And he had worked... look, to cut a long story short, I started tracking down people who knew him or had known him because he'd briefly been at university, and I started putting out feelers as to how I could contact him to see if he'd talk. And I think he might have even been living in Africa at the time. He had been in North Africa, and WikiLeaks had exposed quite a lot of corruption, I think, in Kenya. And one of their contacts had actually been killed.
Two contacts.
I
read the story again last night.
Did you? Right.
It's online now, by the way. I'll link to it in the show notes.
Okay. And so, Assange was this fascinating character, and he was kind of operating as an investigative journalist, but also, he had this whole new thing, which was the world of leaks and using IT. And he had earlier co-written a book about... he was part of a group of young teenage hackers in Melbourne early in his teenage years, who had done some quite audacious hacks and were suspected of being either involved or inspiring the famous hacking of NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration in the US. And a book had been written about that, which he had basically contributed to, but only under his nom de plume, which
his hacker name,
his hacker name, yeah,
Mendax.
And so, in the course of my research, I discovered that Assange was in fact Mendax, which had not been revealed at that time, and that he was this mysterious hacker who'd been, who was kind of a legend in his own lunchtime. And it turned out that this book that he contributed to under the name of Mendax was quite revealing. Once you knew who Mendax was, the book was quite revealing about Assange and his background. And so once I connected that up, I approached Assange and said, look, I'm going to publish this story and I've worked out that you're Mendax. And so, I'm going to run this story, would you talk to me? And he agreed to talk to me. And so he phoned me through some very convoluted process that was full of intrigue and involved, I can't remember, me dialing mysterious phone numbers.
You called a Sydney number and it somehow connected to him overseas. That's how you wrote it in the story.
Yeah, that's right. It was really mysterious. And so I interviewed Assange, and he had not really been interviewed at length, and certainly no one had kind of pieced together the story of his life up to that point. And so I wrote this profile, and I was really pleased with myself. It had been quite difficult to sort of penetrate this veil that he put around himself. And I handed the story in, and my editor, who shall remain nameless, said, "Oh, look, no one's ever heard of this guy. I don't think we'll put him on the cover." Anyway.
One of those that slipped through the fingers.
We won't go there.
Right.
And so Louis Nowra was on the cover instead, bitching about Sydney or something. Anyway, so we published this story, and it was really the first big profile of Assange. And the one thing that really always bugs me about that story is I forgot to look up what Mendax means, and Mendax is based on this Latin word which means the liar who tells the truth or something like that. And it really bugs me to this day that I just didn't do that one thing, that because that's often the line that's quoted now about, that he chose this online identity which speaks so much about his philosophy and of leaking and but anyway, that aside, I was pretty happy with the story. And in fact, for a while there, I chased around the idea of doing a book on Assange, and I spoke to Bloomsbury offered me an advance to do a book on Assange. But by that time, the whole collateral murder thing had blown wide open, and he was emerging as this, and it turned out that he was doing his own book, which of course ended up being a debacle. Yeah. And he was emerging as this sort of somewhat problematic sort of character, who was very difficult to deal with, and I just thought there's so many books in the works about this guy, and I just sort of decided to knock that one on the head, which I'm glad we did.
Between Leonard Cohen and Julian Assange, I wonder which one will last the test of time.
Yeah. Talk about the ones that got away.
All right, perhaps the last thing I'll ask you about is a story that you pursued in 2015, which was about a young woman named Belle Gibson. Do you want to give an overview of how you came to be interested in that?
Yeah, I'd done a story for the magazine about people who have cancer and who decide not to have conventional medical treatment, and who, are drawn to these often very dubious alternative treatments. And that story really fascinated me. And two of the people I interviewed were a daughter and mother who both had cancer. It's a tragic story, and they both decided to avoid conventional treatment. And a couple of years, maybe even 18 months after that story appeared, the mother died. The mother had died within 6 months of me doing the story, I think, and the daughter then became terminally ill. And so I was thinking about doing a follow-up, and I started kind of going online and thinking about, what this follow-up story would be about. And I came across these people on a blog talking about Belle Gibson, who, frankly, I'd never heard of at the time. And Belle Gibson was a Melbourne woman who, as we all know now, ran a health food sort of blog and business, really, selling apps and whatnot. And she claimed to have multiple cancers, primarily a extremely malignant brain tumour, which she claimed that she'd had for 5 years, and 4 other cancers, all of which were potentially fatal, and that she'd somehow survived for years without medical treatment. And as soon as I read this stuff online, and I having done the previous story, there was just something way wrong about the story. However, she'd been in Vogue, she'd been in Elle, she'd been on TV, she had a contract with Apple to do an app for their watch, she had a book contract around the world with Penguin. This book had come out in Australia and was about to be published in the US and UK. She was about to really cash in big time on this story. She was this kind of gorgeous looking, telegenic sort of young woman. And so I started digging around, thinking that I went into my editor and said, there's something way wrong about this story, Like, I spoke to a couple of cancer specialists and said, here's the scenario, 23-year-old woman, rolled it all out. And they said, don't think so. And it's like, how does somebody get away, if it's not true, how is it that she's managed to con all these people in the media? She'd been in the Sydney Morning Herald, it was just one of those weird stories. So I rang up her publisher and said, look, I'd like to interview Belle Gibson because I'm doing a story about people who have got cancer but have not had conventional treatment, which was kind of true. And
omitting some facts of what you
actually... it wasn't a lie, but it wasn't, the entire truth. And so they said, oh, look, yeah, great, we'll get you an interview. And so she was overseas, and I had to wait quite a while for her to come back, like a month. This was another one of these stories that I was just kind of, it was just dying to get my teeth into, but I just had to wait. And so while she was away and while I was waiting for her to get back, I started trying to find out more about her, and I discovered that she basically erased her into her Facebook feed before, about 12 months earlier, had just been completely wiped, and her social media. She'd really kind of erased her life online, and it was only through the Wayback Machine that I was able to sort of just find old blogs of hers and things. The
Wayback Machine, journalists delight,
which I've learned to love, like many journalists. And the thing was, I knew if I started contacting people that she went to school with, and knew that it would get back to her, and I didn't want that to happen before I'd met her. I wanted to meet her and just hear her story from her own mouth, and so I deliberately didn't contact anybody who knew her well. I just sort of was trying to piece together, because she'd been very vague about where she was from, and so finally she agreed to see me, and I went down to Melbourne and met her, and it was one of the strangest interviews I've ever done, because we were in this cafe, and I was just being completely neutral I was just asking her to tell her story about the cancer, when did you get it, and when did you find out, and who was your doctor, and that kind of stuff. And so she was just telling me all these things about these various cancers, and then at a certain point I said, and what about these other cancers? And she suddenly started to sort of become quite querulous and teary, and haltingly said to me that she might not have these other cancers after all, right?
Right.
And that she'd been misdiagnosed by a doctor, and she now realised that maybe she didn't have 5 cancers. And so I'm sitting there thinking, I don't believe this. She's just admitted that she don't, that this cancer story is dubious. But of course she was blaming it on this doctor who'd misdiagnosed her, whose name she wouldn't give me, and she didn't know if he was an actual medical doctor. It was that one of those interviews that just everything just became vague and opaque whenever you tried to get details.
Yeah.
But she actually broke down and started weeping at the table. But she insisted that the brain tumour was, real, because she'd already written in her book that she'd been to a brain surgeon in Perth, some years earlier, and he'd given her this devastating news. So I go back to the office and tell my editor, I think Belle Gibson just confessed to me, but she insists that the brain tumour's for real, And then the thing is, how do you prove someone doesn't have a brain tumour? That's tricky, because maybe she's got a benign tumour, lots of people have benign tumours, and they can live with them. And so it's possible that she did have some sort of benign form of cancer that she'd been living with. And so we couldn't just come right out of the box and say, this woman's a complete phony, But then I really went into it, and I really then started to track down people who knew her. And I did find a lot. It took me a while, but I found a bunch of people who basically said she's been telling these stories since she was 13.
Yeah, right.
She's been inventing stories about cancer since she was in high school. And I found on the Wayback Machine this skateboarding blog that she used to contribute to, and in it she made all these wild, incredible claims that she'd had open heart surgery and died on the operating table. So it was quite clear she had a history of confabulating these stories. And so we published a story basically saying that she admitted that her claims were dubious, and that she had a history of making apparently improbable medical claims, and she'd lied about her age, and she wouldn't give us any information about her doctors. And almost immediately that story appeared, all this stuff that I'd found on the web, like old blogs and the skateboarding things, just started to disappear suddenly, But basically we broke the story that she was a fake, and she just completely went to ground. But it was one of those stories where I wasn't really 100% certain that she wasn't ill in some way, and so there was a certain amount of nervousness about the story because, I didn't know what was wrong or not wrong with this girl. As it turned out, she was a complete and utter fraud, and she has since admitted that all of her cancer claims were completely false.
Yeah, there's a link there between her personality and the repressed memory stuff we were talking about earlier, I think, where it's people fooling others by fooling themselves, perhaps.
Yeah, I was always torn with Belle Gibson about whether I thought she was really a mentally ill person or whether she was just a really, scheming sort of selfish person. And I just think there has to be a part of her that's really quite ill, to do that. And I did certainly see the link with the repressed memory stuff I'd done 20 years earlier, because, and I kind of realised over time that whole thing of people's self-deception, it is a topic that I find really fascinating. I think as a journalist, one of the things you discover over and over is that people's account of themselves is not reliable, I mean, I once did a profile of Earl Owen, who's one of Australia's most famous microsurgeons, and I discovered that these stories he tells about his career and all these extraordinary achievements that he's done over his life, he invented the first microscope for surgery and all this kind of stuff, they're all complete myths that he invented, and So, and often, you talk to people, you're interviewing people, and they tell stories about themselves, and you go back to people who were there at the time, and they go, well, no, that's not the way it happened. So I am really fascinated by this thing of memory and people creating a story about themselves. And Belle Gibson, that was her story. She was this heroic figure who'd triumphed over terrible illness and, was now going out to help the world by promoting natural foods. And I think there's a part of her that actually believed all that was true.
And also, is there an element of people being credulous or giving people the benefit of the doubt if they're saying what people want to hear, or they want to follow someone like her who represented something? That triumph over adversity of being really sick, supposedly, and people feeling inspired and uplifted by following someone like that?
Well, that's part of the story. Maybe even more fascinating is the way that they are able to pull people in like that. People, like you say, want to believe in these things. With the repressed memory thing, certain feminists, certain religious people really wanted to believe all those stories and became passionate about believing them. And with Belle Gibson, I was getting the most hostile emails from people who had been passionate believers in her, who just couldn't conceive of the fact that this was a fraud, and they were pouring out their vitriol to me. Why are you trying to tear this woman down? Was the kind of tone of it all. They just really had so much belief invested in her, and she, of course, had used social media to create a whole kind of world of acolytes and disciples, people who just used to sort of gush to her about what an amazing, uplifting, inspirational woman she was.
Well, it's inspiring for me as another writer and as a mentee of yours to hear how excited you have been and still are about telling stories. I've loved having you as my mentor, and thanks for talking to me today, Richard.
Thanks, Andrew. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening to Penmanship, and thank you to my guest, Richard Guilliatt. You can find show notes to this episode and all previous episodes at penmanshippodcast.com, and I'll point out that there is a link to that profile of David Gulpilil that Richard wrote for Good Weekend in 2002. I highly recommend reading it. It is excellent. If you have feedback for me, I would love to hear from you. Andrew at penmanshippodcast.com is my email. You can find the show on Twitter at penmanshipau and on Facebook. If you enjoy this podcast, there are several ways you can support it. You can share it with people in your life who love reading and talking about great Australian writing. You can share it on social media, or you can leave a review on iTunes or Stitcher or wherever you happen to be listening to this audio. The theme song for Penmanship is Eternally Yours by Laughing Clowns. That's all for now. Until next time.